And the court has defined essentially, as we talked about last night, two forms of executive privilege. The first is what they call one for presidential communications. This assumes basically anything directly communicated to the President of the United States for him to decide the course of the United States government can be protected under the concept of executive privilege. That, though, largely isn't what we're talking about with Fast and Furious. There's no real indication from either the Obama administration or those inquiring into it that this has been something that President Obama has been coordinating. So rather, what they've invoked is the second kind of executive privilege, which is called the deliberative process executive privilege, meaning basically the underlings of President Obama, in discussing amongst themselves the policies and the paths for governing the United States, can be exempt from having those discussions brought forward in front of the American people and scrutinized. Because the reason is we want them to have full discussions amongst themselves, feeling safe from that scrutiny. However, this is not one that President Obama, this deliberative process privilege, has really endorsed. In fact, back in 2007, during the Bush administration, he told the Boston Globe this: with respect to the core of executive privilege, the Supreme Court has not resolved this question, and reasonable people have debated it. But my view is that executive privilege generally depends on the involvement of the President and the White House. Basically, what he's saying there is that second form of executive privilege, the one he's now invoking, deliberative process, isn't one he gives a lot of weight to. Rather, it should only cover things immediately discussed by the President. So we have at least one of two things on our hands. We either have hypocrisy, we have something you condemned when you were not President that you embrace when you are, or we have an indication that the President directly discussed Fast and Furious with Eric Holder or others in the administration. Now, Buck, you asked me a question earlier today when we were backstage. You said, do you think, Will, this is a proper invocation of executive privilege? And I said to you, I don't really know. Because to answer that question, we have to know what's in the documents.
Right.
Well, there's also an issue of the blanket assertion in this case, isn't there? And that saying that executive privilege extends to thousands of pages of documents, and which brings us to sort of what I think the path could be, which is to request an individual page-by-page, document-by-document litigation. You have to say, this is why this is covered by executive privilege, in order to not have to produce those documents.
Well,
that would seem to be the obvious case, because otherwise you could just, the privilege becomes just anything you want it to be and everything you want it to be.
And my question about this is, my understanding is that the court said that this deliberative process privilege, it, quote, disappears altogether when there's any reason to believe government misconduct has occurred. And isn't that precisely what the House committee is trying to investigate, which is government misconduct? Selling illegal firearms to Mexican drug dealers to be walked across the border, used in crimes, one of which ended up being used in killing a Border Patrol agent. So under that standard, can the DOJ still stonewall and block these documents citing executive privilege?
But I think the investigation is actually on the cover-up. I mean, well, at least that's been the defense.
Well.
Right,
like,
right.
There's two. There's the original operation, and then there's the cover-up of telling the committee we didn't know any, Fast and Furious didn't exist, and then retracting that statement. So
that's
there
the
seem
2011
to be two
letter,
levels of this.
Yeah, so which is the executive privilege being applied to?
Well, according to the Obama administration, it is on the cover-up, as you said.
Right.
It's regarding the 2011 letter that said there was no gun running. Fast and Furious essentially did not exist in the form you think it did. And then, of course, they retracted that.
Right.
So Darrell Ison wants to know, why did you retract that? Why did you say that and then retract that?
A false statement to Congress is criminal. So if you're making the case that criminal acts are not covered under this, it would seem to be that you can't just say, well, are bad on that one, that you can't just retract things without there being consequences.
But I think the distinction, and my point was sort of to the political aspect of this, is that the Democrats' defense is that this is not litigating what happened with Fast and Furious, what happened to Brian Terry. This is litigating the cover-up. And therefore, Democrats allege this is far more political, because it's not actually, Republicans don't actually want to get to the heart of what happened in Fast and Furious.
That's a good transition. Let's put up right now a poll of where Barack Obama and Mitt Romney stand in the polls, because, Essie, in the end, while it seems like you trivialize things, you, the proverbial you, when you say this is political, the truth is it is political.
Of course it is.
Because the end is the check, even as a substantive matter on this process, the check on Eric Holder and the check on Barack Obama is a political check. I mean,
Is it
there's an
the
election
courts or
3
the-
months away.
Well, and
the
they're
election
using
is 3
both
months
sides
away.
are
wouldn't be
using this
affected in a poll
politically.
right now. I don't think we would see this in a poll right now. I think it would be a little bit of time beyond this.
Well, that's the question now. How will this play?
In a
in
poll.
those-
But to that, I mean, you want to know. I've heard on both sides that Obama and Holder are using this to not talk about the economy, right? And then I've heard on the Republican side that this is bad for Republicans because Republicans don't get to talk about the economy. I don't know. I mean, it seems to me Darrell Issa started this investigation a while ago, not thinking, I think legitimately not thinking it was going to take this long.
The economy could be great. He wouldn't have been. He can't
That's
control events like
absolutely
that.
right.
One thing that I'm almost sad to tell our viewers at home about, but hasn't really come up, is that the Attorney General made his career on public integrity cases. The public integrity section of the Justice Department is where he began his career in government. Yeah. And he actually was also the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, which is, some people have said, where the case could be referred by Congress. He understands the ins and outs of this better than pretty much anybody else you could possibly imagine. So when you're asking where is this going forward, he understands how to roll the ball back. He understands how to hide it. He knows every trick in the book to make sure that this process is strewn out beyond the electoral.
For one moment.
Just a quick question.
Yeah, sure.
What happens if it's determined that this is not the proper use of executive privilege? Let's say that this is not, he shouldn't be doing this. What's the next step? What happens then?
Well, that is
Who
a very
decides that?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question to answer, because this can take the form of two paths through the contempt charge, a criminal path or a civil path. But the path is to sue and then overcome that executive privilege to produce the documents. But that's why politics becomes the check, because you're talking about a long, drawn-out process that you might get to, in the end, the truth of Fast and Furious, but these guys could be long gone.
Why are we